Knowledge of the lived experience of our ancestors can help us appreciate who we've become, what we believe, and how we relate to the world around us. On this episode of Race Talk with Lane and Eugene, renowned industrial psychologist Dr. Edwin J. Nichols uses his paradigm, the philosophical aspects of cultural difference, to explain the disparate effects of the COVID-19 saga on our collective communities. This episode originally aired June 30th, 2021.
Ooh-wee. Good day, good afternoon, good morning to everybody. To the new people, welcome. This is Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene. I am Eugene Holden. I am your co-host. And I just wanted to again welcome you to Race Talk Revolution. Race Talk Revolution is it's a platform where we get to talk about the racism, the systemic racism, and how that affects all of us. And this platform also is a place where, and you hear me say this every week, where your voice matters. At Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene, your voice matters. Really excited about today's guest, as I am every week, but today is a really great day. And our topic today is the psychological ramifications of COVID-19 on African Americans. Our speaker today is Dr. Edwin J. Nichols, PhD. Now, this is important, right? Please remember that Race Talk Revolution is a loving, respectful, inclusive platform, and this is designed to encourage constructive dialogue around these tough issues pertaining to racial and social injustice here in America. It is a safe space for people of all backgrounds to share, to learn, to grow our anti-racism muscles. In our Race Talk community, we practice radical, inclusive love. Even when we don't understand or agree with what's being shared, we listen with respect, appreciation, and empathy. Our commitment is that every person be encouraged, heard, and appreciated, because remember, on Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene, your voice matters. Lane?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome to another Wednesday afternoon. We are so excited, as Eugene said, to have the eminent Dr. Edwin J. Nichols with us this afternoon. And he's going to be sharing from his paradigm the philosophical aspects of cultural difference. And I'm very excited about this, and you will be too once he gets started talking. So right now, I'm going to go ahead and introduce him. Dr. Edwin J. Nichols, PhD, is a clinical industrial psychologist and founding member of the Association of Black Psychologists. He is director of Nichols and Associates Incorporated, an applied behavioral science firm which specializes in the development of cultural competence in the workplace. Dr. Nichols was the first Black to head a center at the National Institute of Mental Health, serving as Chief of Child and Family Mental Health. He was a visiting professor at the University of, I should know how to pronounce this, Ibadan, Nigeria, and established the Child's Clinic for Psychological Assessment and Evaluation. His American and international IO work is guided by his paradigm, the philosophical aspects of cultural difference, first presented in 1976 at the World Psychiatric Conference held at the University of Ibadan. He was educated at Assumption College in Canada, Tübingen University in Germany, and received his PhD in psychology and psychiatry cum laude at Innsbruck University in Austria. Dr. Nichols, thank you so much. We are so excited to have you here. I find your work fascinating, as you already know, and the fact that your paradigm is so deep and yet so understandable in terms of explaining why things are the way they are, and that it can be used to explain so much of what makes us tick. I just can't wait to hear what you have to say today. So thank you and welcome. And the floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to share concepts and ideas with you and the audience. And of course, I'm going to cough. So I haven't coughed all day, but now I need to cough and take some water. I don't know. what I would like to do is to share with you experiences that as an African American, they're not unusual for African Americans, but they may be unusual for some of you as the experiences that we have. I was raised in a loving family. My parents were married for 7 years before I was born. They married early, did their schooling and traveling and lots of things. And then after 7 years, I was born. And of course, I was born right in the middle of the Depression. You couldn't have planned it better. But the information that we always had was, if you work hard, get a good education, then you will be assimilated into the mainstream. Now, in terms of acculturation, as African Americans, we've been acculturated into American culture for generations, for centuries. But what has not happened is we have not moved from acculturation to assimilation. Other groups, like the Irish and like Jews, came to this country and they were not acculturated and therefore could not be assimilated. After a generation when their children stopped speaking Yiddish or Irish dialects, that generation was acculturated as Americans. And then the Irish and the Jews and other groups were Italians and so on, were assimilated into the mainstream. And that process of assimilation is called whiteness. So there are two books that I might recommend to you. One that says When the Irish Became White, and the other is When Jews Became White Folks. These are two books that explain that construct of first being foreign, different, and different means not white, then acculturation, and then assimilated into whiteness when you get all the privileges of white privilege. The assumption has always been with the African American community, if you get the next step, whatever that is that the society requires, in the acculturation, then you will be assimilated, but that's the cognitive dissonance. I started very early, membership to the YMCA. I took classical dance. I had fisting on horseback riding. My home is Detroit. And these things I did in Windsor because they were not available to Blacks in Detroit at that time. I had piano lessons, I had organ lessons, I had all the things, and I tell my parents that they prepared me to be a count, but there's so few vacancies left. So, but those were the things that they did to make sure that I would be thoroughly acculturated. My grandmother was born just a few years after slavery, and my grandfather was actually born a slave on my maternal side. My grandmother said, we are forced to live in the ghetto, but we are not of the ghetto. So this was her way of expressing the idea that we are thoroughly acculturated and should be, without question, assimilated. This is a very important differential because this is the point of frustration and cognitive dissonance for many African Americans and for our children particularly. Having experienced this on many levels, like once with the master's level, they called me to come to work for a consulting firm. I had just returned from Tübingen. I had done my practicum with Ernst Kretschmer at Mercedes-Benz and Zeiss Icon. I had worked for Kretschmer, doing private work for him as a work experience, not just as a student, but as an employee. And I returned to the States, and there was a job offering in Cleveland. And one of my students from Germany had filled that position. He was going back to Germany. And they said, oh, you don't need the degree, just stay here, anything. Oh, they went on and on to say what they would do for him if he would just stay and complete the work that they were not familiar with. At first, he came here, Hans came here to learn what we were doing, improve his English, and then go back to Germany. Well, found out that the Germans were ahead of us at that time in organization development. So They were offering everything. He said, well, look, my supervisor just returned from Tübingen, lives in Detroit. Why don't you give him a call, see if he'll come to Cleveland? Well, they talked and begged on the phone. Oh, they were so excited. When I went there, it was like, oh, there's some mistake. Well, of course, the mistake was that I was Black. They were looking for some German, I guess. I don't know. Now, the point that was cognitively dissonance for me is you don't give me a job, yet the work that has to be done, you package it and send it to the YMCA, and you write a letter saying, complete the work that Hans has not completed. Parentheses, send it back, do not bring it back. Last sentence, enclosed is a check, fill in your fee and cash it, signed Green. Now that's cognitive dissonance for me because you refuse to hire me, yet you insist that for any price of money, you want the work that I'm able to give you. Well, I determined that I certainly needed the PhD. That's the only answer. So I received a fellowship from the Austrian Ministry of Education. It is called 10 aus aller Welt, which is 10 scholarships for all the world. I received one of the 10 in 1959. I returned to Austria, to Europe rather, and went to Austria. And I did my PhD and under one of the leading scholars for that, which was Ivo Kohler. And then I returned to the United States. My dissertation was on apprenticeships. I helped to translate the GAPI, General Aptitude Test Battery, into German, and I helped to establish norms for German apprentices that start their apprenticeship at 14. When I came back to Detroit, there's a bulletin called the American Psychological Association Bulletin at that time, an employment bulletin, and every state has vacancies that are available. There was an available job in Flint, Michigan with the General Motors College. That's what it was called at that time. And they wanted to expand and understand how to have apprentices go out and work for so many weeks and come back, and the schooling and the scheduling and all that arrangement. In addition, they wanted to develop a cadre of apprentices from the high schools into the workforce, and some would go on into the college. That's my dissertation. So the man read all these papers. He was just ecstatic, and he was begging me, oh, please come to Flint, please come to Flint. Well, when I arrived, he was a little cool. And I went in, I was all excited. I'm showing everything I've got and blah, blah, blah. And then finally I asked, I said, well, is there anything that I'm missing that you want? Or what else do you? He says, you have everything that I want or could have hoped for, more than I could have even hoped for in qualifications. But you know, you should not have applied. You're a Negro. Well, that had been self-evident for me for a very long time. And again, this was cognitive dissonance. You want this title, this skill, and you forfeit it for someone's race, color, what have you. So being acculturated has not given us the option to be assimilated, which is white privilege and whiteness. So I'm going to start there now to talk about what then did I have to go through in my mind to come to the paradigm that I'm going to share with you. At the master's level, all people in Germany that are going to be psychoanalysts have to go into your own analysis. So I had already been in analysis. So when I came out to the situation in Cleveland, I went into an analytical analysis of why Mr. Green would want to send me a check, and was it a paternal thing? Was he a father figure? Well, I was going through all those things. None of those things worked out because you come out with this is pathological, and everybody that's white is not sociopathic. So that didn't work. When I came back from Austria, Austria requires whatever your major is. I had a double major. I had industrial as well as clinical psychology. But in Austria, you're required to have another major, which is philosophy. So with the philosophical background that I had, after that experience in Flint, Michigan with General Motors, I made a decision that perhaps these are philosophical differences. I was privileged to read an article by Thomas Lambo, a famous Nigerian Yoruba psychiatrist, first European trained psychiatrist. And he said simply when he was asked, is there a difference between Africa and the Western world? And he said, I find that the Western world is concerned with objects, and the African world, we're concerned with relationships. Well, when I read that, the light bulbs went off, because in classical philosophy, that's axiology, the study of values. So he had already given me the value system for the Europeans lying in the object, and the value system for Africans lying in the relationship. I had already studied Asian culture, so I knew that the highest value for them was group cohesiveness. So I had my paradigm, and then I began to develop not just the axiology, but you had to develop an epistemology, which is how do people know things? What is difference in the way people approach problem solving? And then finally, do we all reason using logic to the same, do we reason in the same way? Do we come to an answer in our logic system in the same way? And they're different. So that is the crux of what I'm going to share with you now. So if we can go to terms, I'll just give some of those very quickly. All right, the first there that you see is as cultural competence. Cultural competence is the capacity to extract and accept and utilize the uniqueness of another group's worldview or Weltanschauung. Actually, you can just say their problem-solving skills. You see, it's the capacity to extract. You have to be able to hear someone from their frame of reference and extract from that which is of value. Then you accept it without criticizing or without having to have them transliterated into your way of thinking and utilize it. Now, why? Because in the world of work, this is the ability to know an issue from the perspective of your opponent, staff, or your client. It is the value added. It gives the enhanced market share and the competitive edge. As we talk about a global society, we know from the literature that homogeneous groups making decisions, that's primarily an all-white male group, are not as creative or as efficient or as effective as heterogeneous groups, which would be males and females, different ethnic groups, and what have you. That work is already established by Paige Scott, who is a university professor, University of Michigan. You go online, you can see his work. So if we're going to survive in the global economy, we have to utilize all the resources we have in the United States, rather than to have an us and other. And that concept of us, whiteness, and other, non-white, has created, when I talk about the COVID experience, it creates cognitive dissonance between two different groups that are experiencing the same phenomena. I want to go now all the way down to, well, let's see, I may talk about axiological ethics later on, but let's go down to where it says thesis. Do we have that? Yes, all right, thesis. All right, human difference comes out of multi-generational responses to the basic human need to survive and thrive. So as I look at each of these cultures, what was necessary for your ethnic group going back to its origin, not just a couple thousand years, but thousands of years back when it first started. Now, Europeans are the youngest and newest ethnic group because you could only get into Europe and settle in Europe at the end of the last ice age. You could go north in Italy, but you couldn't get as far as Switzerland, and certainly not into Germany and on up to Sweden, because it was covered with glaciers and you just could not survive in that until that ice age melted. And that's 20, 22, 25,000 years, depends on who the book from whom you're reading will tell you how long ago it was. But I'm just simply saying it was the end of the last ice age. Now, as I talk about this to survive and thrive, when I first did this, it was to look at things from Carl Gustav Jung and his collective unconscious memory. That's where I placed the origin of these things, that it was our unconscious cultural bias, collective unconscious memory. But I've lived long enough that we now have eugenics that tell us the behavior can be affected by events in previous generations, which are passed on through a form of genetic memory. So as African Americans, we carry trauma from our slavery experience. As Europeans, you carry the trauma of seeing people around you that did not do what was necessary to be alive next spring, and they died. And we're going to talk about some of those things. Philosophy affords us an example of the essence of ethnic difference. Through the difference value sets, axiology, the way of knowing, epistemology, the way of reasoning to an answer, and logic are the things I'm going to talk about. And then competition for resources gains societal acceptance, and that's called axiological ethics. And we might get into that. I'm not sure, but we might get into that. The existentialistic reality to survive and survive promulgates individualistic acts in the European culture. In Europe, we always want to know who is number, hold up your finger so I can see, number one, who is the very best, who is on top, how many people are they? One person. So the construct in European thinking is individualism. That's the survival. When you look to Africans, it's a collective. You and I have to work together to accomplish a task. It's a one-on-one basis to accomplish anything. Asian is, the African is a collaborative, the Asian is a collective. Asian culture requires that there's a collective of people that work together as a group to accomplish a task. In Native culture, it's communal. Now, what's the difference between collective and communal? Communal requires governance. So whenever you have a group of Native Americans, they always have a tribal council or some way to govern. And that's the difference between communal and collective. A collective can just be a group of people. Communal says you have a tribal council of people that give you information to make decisions as a whole. All right, let's turn now to the paradigm itself. If you look in the left column, it says Europeans, Africans, Asians, and Native Americans. So Europeans came from Europe, Africans from Africa, Asia from Asia, and the Native Americans are already here. Now, when you go back to the top, it says that there are groups that share an ethnic worldview. So if you classify yourself as Latina or as Hispanic, you share an ethnic worldview, because to be Hispanic is not an ethnic group in and of itself. You could have ethnic groups too that are Hispanic, which are, you could be a white Hispanic, a black Hispanic, you can be an Asian Hispanic, you can be a Native American Hispanic. And all of those can be Hispanic, but they do not constitute an ethnic group. They constitute a group that share an ethnic worldview. That's the differentiation. Now, the first column is axiology. The middle column is epistemology, which is broken down into an applied epistemology, a pedagogy, and a methodology. Then logic is the last major column, and process we may or may not get to. All right, so I'm going to run through these very quickly so that you have a frame of reference from which to work. If the highest value lies in the object or the acquisition of the object, how did one in Europe survive and thrive with that construct? If I place you back in Europe to the origin of European identity as Europeans, in order to be alive next spring, can you plant seeds and grow food in the months of September, October, November? No. What about December, January, February? No. March, April, May. May, in Minnesota, the ground is still what in May? And the border with Minnesota and Canada is the border of southern Germany to Switzerland. So that gives you an idea that you only have 3 months in which to plant seeds, harvest them, store them before the end of the season, which is, if you haven't done this, you end up dead. Now, there are no second chances. There's no place to go get some. You can't borrow some and so on. Now, if I have enough food with 9 bushels of food for the 9 months and 1 extra bushel, and you say to me, Nichols, please give me that bushel. You're asking me to share. What is the probability that I will share? So sharing as a construct could be defeating. It could cost you your death. And sharing doesn't enter into the active practices of Europeans until the advent of Christianity, which comes with the concept of sharing. Now, let's look at this group of people again. In order to have enough food, the man has to hunt. Now, what he did with his bow and arrow at that time was simply to hunt with a bow and arrow, but it could only penetrate the hide of a rabbit or a squirrel or something like that, but not the hide of a deer, because that powerful a bow doesn't come into about the 12th century when the English developed ones they use like artillery. So here we are at year 1. And so what they have to do is develop technologies to get food. The technologies, pits, snares, and traps for the large game. But you can't suggest to a deer or a buffalo or something to say, would you please walk into the pit, the snare, or the trap? They don't do that. You have to herd them into it. And the women were used for the herding. And the men were at the pit, the snare, the trap, to impale and kill the wild animal. Now, some women are now in their 3rd trimester. Could they be running up and down the mountains in Europe at that time? No, they return to their place of residence. And what do they do there? They become very cognizant of everything around them, very observant. They're observing everything. They too are in labor. Well, you have little animals that are in labor and they start in the process of delivery. You have a little goat that started labor. It's not going very well for this little goat. The goat travels just over to that little bush, nibbles the leaves from the bush, dilates and delivers. You see other animals in labor, when it's not going well, go to that bush, nibble, dilate, and deliver. If you're a lady in labor and it doesn't going well, what do you think they were likely to do? Now, from those experiences, European women developed a pharmacopoeia by understanding the pharmaceutical properties of roots, herbs, grasses, roots, and leaves. Now, men don't share in this body of knowledge because they're off on the hunt, trying to get enough food. Now, at this point, we gathered food last year, but a lot of it spoiled because we didn't know how to preserve it. Who is going to have the technology transfer for the preservation of food? Well, now it's again women, because from those pharmacological understanding of roots, herbs, barks, grasses, fruits, and leaves, you realize that a dillweed tea will settle your stomach and keep you from vomiting, but dillweed will also preserve food. So this is a technology transfer that women have that men don't have because they're off on the hunt. Now, if the object is the highest value, who now is possessing most of the objects? And we're going to go one more. Women had a mathematical understanding and a capacity to understand time as it moved from one space to another, long before men could grasp the concept. Women had the concept of counting and measuring because of the gestation period, 9 months, the menses, approximately 28 days. And later in history and culture, Jewish women had the concept of fertilization, when to get pregnant and when not to get pregnant, because of the mikvah, the bath of purification. So what I'm sharing with you is that women had developed a skill that men didn't have for a very long time. So if the woman says at the end of February, at the end of the third moon, you can plant, that's March, April, May, at the end of May, you can plant. This man's saying there's snow everywhere. How can you do that? How can you know that? So that was too much knowledge. And so men, in order to regain knowledge in Europe, began to stratify the difference between men and women. So you have some legal things that come into play. According to European law, European women are the property of their husbands historically. They had a dowry, they brought their dowry, it became the property of their husband. So if they accidentally, and he divorced them, they would be penniless. So it kept them where the dowry was. And then, according to English common law, if your wife was causing you difficulty, she needed to be disciplined, you could discipline her with a stick about the size of a dowel or my thumb. So this is what happened in terms of the European context. Now, let's look and see what happens when we go immediately to an African context, which is centuries, centuries and centuries early as a construct, earlier. We know that Africa is the cradle of civilization. It's the cradle of our species as humans. So in this culture, the relationship between men and women is one of equality. So if the highest value is in the relationship, this is very important, because if you're going to understand how Black people think and how Black people feel and how Black people get insulted and offended, then this you want to look at. The highest value is in the relationship. If you do something that treats me as less than equal, you treat me as less than equal, you have treated me with disrespect, and disrespect destroys relationships. If you go to the last century, one of the most popular songs by Anita Franklin was RS, and you can spell the rest, okay? So that's how powerful the construct of respect is within the African-American community and within Africa, and also within the Latin community. The idea of respect. People start out by seeing each other as being equal. So if you're my boss, you may outrank me, but in our interpersonal relationship, I expect you to treat me as an equal, which means to treat me with respect. Because if you treat me with disrespect, it doesn't matter how much you outrank me, the relationship is destroyed. There is no relationship. Now let's look into some of the personality factors or some of the characteristics of the African woman. If you see yourself as equal, then prove it. If we compare then the experience of the European woman with the African woman, in Africa, can you get your own food? Or you have to rely on someone else to help get the food? Well, food is omnipresent in Africa, so you can get it. If your husband were angry with you and told you, get out, would you freeze to death and die? Or could you go out and get some palm leaves and arrange them in such a way to keep the sun off of you? Okay. Now, let's look at some other differences. This is the wedding. Here's the African woman has come with gold bangles, gold bracelets, gold necklace, gold earrings, gold clips in her hair, gold everywhere. And you ask the African American women around you, do you take off all your gold and give it to your husband? And you'll see real cognitive dissonance, like, no, don't even go there, okay? So the reality is that the African woman has kept her dowry. And the reason for that is if anything happens to the man, the African woman is able to take care of herself and her children. And this was a very important dependent variable for African slaves and the slave woman's experience. A strong husband could be sold to some other plantation, even sold away from the state you could escape from. and he's gone, but you're left there with a child. What daycare facilities were available for the African slave woman when it's time to go to the field? What food was cooked for her and provided for her? So you see that the women had the idea that if anything happened to the male, they must be able to take care of themselves and their children. And that meant she would take care of this infant until 7. And that's the point at which most children that were sold would be sold away from their mothers at age 7. So they'd have no real memory of the mother and of the original family structure. All right, let's go now to the next one, which is the highest value lies in oneness, in the cohesiveness of the group. This is Asian culture. In trying to make the migratory trek, we're always trying to figure out survive and thrive. So as people are making the migration from the Tigris and Euphrates coming together and start that migratory trek across Asia, they encounter deserts and storms and all kinds of things. They get into mountain ranges where you can't figure, do you go north or south, or which way do you go? And all of those things said that you could not travel like are in this country with a covered wagon, one family traveling to the east, as very often happened. That would never come into consciousness for the Asian culture. So they always moved in a group. Now, if the group is too massive and you come upon a water source with your cattle and humans and everything, you would exhaust it. So groups have to be something that is manageable, but where every person has the responsibility for a task and you understand what your task is, and that keeps the group cohesive. So let's examine and see what some of those things are. We are now going from point A to point B in the desert, the Obi Desert up there in Asia. Now, when you go from point A to point B, can you be assured that you'll find everything that you need at point B? The answer is no. So you have to pack very carefully and take everything with you. But anybody that knows about packing and unpacking knows that somebody forgot something. So we're now at point B. Did you bring the tent poles? Well, no, I thought you were. Did you bring the skins to go over the tent poles? Well, no, I thought you did. And that kind of thing is disruptive. So how do they resolve it? They use their metaphysical symbolism, the yin and the yang. That is male and female forces in balance and harmony, not just balance, but balance and harmony. Harmony means I accept what my role is, and I balance, and that harmony keeps our group cohesive. So what they did then was to ascribe function based on gender. There are certain things that women do, and there are certain things that men do. If the women do all the things they're supposed to do and the men do all the things they're supposed to do, then you are in balance and harmony, and the group stays cohesive. All right, let's look very quickly at Native Americans. It says that the highest value is in oneness with the Great Spirit. Native Americans are indeed very spiritual people because they keep omnipresent the idea of their relationship with the Great Spirit. No decisions are made, no directions are made, nothing is made without a real consultation with the Great Spirit. And as you study, as we go further, the way that you do that is through the purification of yourself so that you're receptive to the Great Spirit. And that can be sweat lodges or tobacco or sage. Different groups have different ways. But in order to get what is truth and what is good and what is going to be beneficial to you, for an example, if you're waiting for the buffalo herds to go through the mountain ranges of North America, of all those mountain ranges, which one are they going to go through? You could be 2 mountain ranges in one space, and they're coming 2 mountain ranges in another space, and you would miss the flow, and you'd freeze to death and die. But in constant contact with the Great Spirit, they are led to the passage that this large herd of buffalo are going to go through. So if you look very carefully at all their myths and stories and so forth, you'll find that there's a great reliance on this personal one-on-one contact with the Great Spirit. Okay, let's look very quickly at epistemology. And in European culture, we are going to use Plato's terms. And Plato tells you that Europeans, there are many choices, but the Europeans choose cognition, which is counting and measuring. And in order to teach this to children, which is the pedagogy, they go back to the Greeks again, and the animist, Democritus, is the one that they follow in European culture, because Democritus says, I mix the pronunciation. Democritus, you say here, I learned Democritus in Europe. So if I mix the two, I'm trying to get clear on it. Democritus said that in the void, there are very small particles that come together and form new essences. So when the science in Europe advanced in the physics enough to recognize that there were small particles in this void, they named them the same name that Democritus had given us, which is atoms. That's how we get the word atoms. Now, the methodology for accomplishing anything in European culture is linear and sequential. Anytime you write a report, you want Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, Roman numeral 3, capital A, capital B, capital C, small Roman numeral, italic Roman numeral 1, 2, and then lowercase a, b. That kind of sequential behavior is orderly, methodologically accepted, and that is the standard for European report writing and so on. So if the highest value is in the object and you want to know it, in Western culture, you have to be able to count it and measure it. Now I'm going on to the next one, which is the African way of knowing. I thought I had cut it off. I did cut it off earlier. Okay, I'm sorry. The highest value is in the cohesiveness of the group. And the way to know is one knows through transcendental striving. Now raise that just a bit and you see conation. Raise that just a little bit higher.
Yeah, yes, we're at.
Oh, okay, go the other way. All right, there we are, right there. I'm sorry. Let's go up. I'm sorry. I'm giving the wrong one.
You skipped one, yes.
Yeah, I skipped one. The highest value in the African American way of knowing is symbolic imagery and rhythm. Now, that comes also from Plato. And Plato calls that way of knowing intuition, the ability to understand something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning. And you see the other system, cognition, requires conscious reasoning. Now, what is symbolic imagery and what is rhythm? Well, now here again, you are not able to accept what I give you. Therefore, I must spend the time to figure out how to transliterate my way of thinking to a European way of thinking so you can accept it and count it and measure it. Rhythm. It doesn't mean clapping your hands, it's biorhythms. You go to the hospital, the nurse will take a stethoscope and listen to the rhythm of your heart. If the heart is out of rhythm, it is not functioning properly. What about symbolic imagery? The MRI is a machine that you're connected to, and it will listen to the rhythm of the heart and the pulse of the blood going through all of your arteries and veins. And it's a little squiggles on a chart. And those little symbolic imageries can be read, and you can know if the heart is functioning correctly. Now, if you had been in a competition with world researchers and worlds producing products in the global economy, how long is it going to take me to concentrate and think, how can I get a European to understand what I'm saying and transliterate it, rather than to say to you, like if you read Blink, by Gadwell, in the first section of the book, he talks about intuition. He doesn't call it that. There's a Kuros that the Museum of San Francisco, the Getty Museum, is going to purchase. And he pulls the tarp off, and one woman looks at it and she says, there's something wrong with the fingers. For her, she was getting the big picture and she was cutting to the chase, which is holistic thinking and critical path analysis. When another woman went down, who's an expert, he pulled the cover off and she said, I hope you didn't buy it, because she got holistic thinking about it, a big picture. And immediately with critical path analysis, she said, this is not genuine. Well, these are only women, and we know women have all kinds of issues and problems. Let's call on a man at the museum, in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. We'll fly him out to San Francisco. I mean, he's an expert, he's a man, he will know. Well, he comes out, and when they pull the tarp off, he says, it's too fresh. Now go back to symbolic imagery. How can a Kuros statue be fresh or stale? But it was his symbolic imagery of telling you that if it is truly what it was supposed to be, it would not be in the state in which I see it. It is too fresh. So I'm trying to share with you that there are different ways of knowing. And if you force one group to transliterate into your way of knowing, rather than to say, I accept it, like the situation with the Kuros, which is I accept it, it's a fraud, I won't buy it, rather than to do what they did do, which was to go to they went to the School of Engineering, the California School of Technology. And an expert there came and measured with 7 microscopic, all kinds of things you can imagine. And he assumed that it was correct, it was fine. But they finally took this Kuros all the way to Greece. And in Greece, the people said, one guy said, the hands, those are the hands of my picture in my book. I pictured those. Somebody said, that head, that's in the Museum of Berlin. So whoever had done this had taken all these parts and assembled them, but the whole was not there. It was just assembly of parts which did not make the whole. All right, let's go now.
So Dr. Nichols, let me interrupt you if I might, please. And I hate to interrupt genius at work, but it is 10 minutes to 1. We have until 1:30. What I'm wondering is if we can get through all this real quick. And
then, let me finish logic real quickly.
Okay.
And then we'll be able to talk.
Okay.
Okay. So if the highest value lies in the object, okay, the axiology of the European, go up one more, there we are. Then how do you know, is the object yes or no? Is it the object yes or no? So go over to logic. There we go. All right, let's stop there. There, see the dichotomous logic in European thinking? So in European thinking, dichotomous logic is primary. Yes or no? That's what we want to know. Is this the object? Yes, it is. No, it is not. It's binary. There's nothing wrong with binary, but you can misuse dichotomous logic to form isms, and we could talk about that another time. Now, if the highest value is in the relationship, you have an opinion, I have an opinion. In this culture, we want to maintain the relationship. I have an opinion, you have an opinion. Now, in the European culture, if I'm right, you're wrong. Or if you're right, I'm wrong. And the relationship doesn't stay intact in that relationship. So you have to have a logic system that will pull those two together. So diunital was developed by Vern Dixon. It is a union of opposites. Now I also have Hispanics and Arabs in this same grouping. So do they have a comparable logic system in their systems? Yes. In the Latin system, the Aztecs used what was called difracismo, which again is two forces coming to union. Do the Arabs have it? Yes, it's Barzarach. And Ibn Arabi, this very famous Arab philosopher, tells us, look at my hands, it is the in between. All right, let's go to the next one, which is the logic system for Asia. And that says the objective world is conceived independent of your thought and mind. So if we think that we can't count it and measure it to know it, they tell you that's nonsense. We say, well, it's chaos if we can't count it and measure it. They say just because you can't count it and measure it doesn't mean it doesn't exist and that it is. So the objective world is conceived completely independent of your thought and your mind. We grow in skills and we understand more about the objective world, but it's independent of our thought and mind. It's not contingent upon whether we can understand it or not. All right, let's go to the questioning.
So the question, we were speaking about the psychological impact of COVID-19 on African Americans, given that they've lived under the auspices or the of white supremacy, and we're talking about how groups of people experiencing the same situation reason things differently, and what the damage is when we can't communicate or think in the same way, or try to ram some logic, foreign logic, into our way of thinking. And I think that's the question in the conversation, sir. So
okay. All right, let's start with there are 4 primary psychological fears. The first fear is the fear of death, the fear of loss, the fear of conflict, and the fear of the future. And as I said before, in our society, there is the us and the other. All right? The us, when this COVID first came out, they didn't believe that it would affect them because these are good people, they're young people, they're strong, they're what have you. And you couldn't force me to wear a mask because of my constitutional rights. And all of these things were given. This was with the us group, all right? Now, once the stark realization came to them that indeed they could catch it and die, the fear was paralyzing. And then the question was, well, why didn't I know? Why was I told it would be okay? If you think back in terms of what was going on television and things that were coming out of the government, it was no big deal. But when these people began to die, they're wondering, why is this happening to me? I don't understand it. And then that is when you begin to have the us wondering, why am I becoming and being treated just like the other when we have always been special? Now, the fear of loss comes when the us, for the first time in their lives, didn't have enough money to pay the rent or the mortgage. Will I lose my home? Will I lose my apartment? For the first time, the idea was I might lose my job. I'm educated, I have a master's degree, but the way things are going now, I could lose it. And then there was the loss of self-esteem. For many people of the us group, for the first time in their lives, they had to line up for food.
okay, so when you're talking about the us group, you're talking about the white America.
The white America, yes.
All right,
Yes.
thank you.
Okay. They had to line up for food. Now, listen to how a society changes words and vocabulary to make things more palatable. Because these other people were lining up for free food. They were shiftless and lazy, and they were getting food stamps and all these negative things.
The other people.
That was the others. But when the us came into the same thing, what did they do? They said food insufficiency. So you have to listen to grammar and language to see how a differentiation is made to give comfort to one who would have felt horrible standing in line. It's bad enough. But if you're standing in a line for food because you don't have adequate food, well, let's change it to food insufficiency. Now, those are the loss fears. And those are a lot of questions that come about that insecurity. How am I going to feed my children? What am I going to do to entertain them while I'm here? So now we get to the concept of the fear of conflict. when people have to stay in their homes, the conflict is there. I don't care how big your house is, how many rooms you have. After people are in the house 24 hours a day, somebody gets on somebody else's last nerve, okay? So what do people do? Now, this is where we begin to find out what are some of the things that happen. Well, you can have people who turn their anger upon the self. Anger turned upon the self is depression. And then sometimes they begin to self-medicate. Alcohol, drugs. In Ohio, it's the methamphetamines that they take. Then some turn to another way of escaping, which is they go to gaming on the computer. They do hours and hours of gaming. Another group starts to gamble, and that can be difficult because you're wasting money. Sometimes you're losing. And then finally, something that is new as a phenomena, a national phenomenon, is the watching of pornography. I have young priests that I do consultation with. This is one of the biggest confessions they don't know how to answer.
Can you say that one more time, sir?
Yeah, one of the biggest, I have young priests that come for consultation, all right? And they're priests and they're in confessions and they're asking psychologically, what can I say to somebody in the confessional that is addicted to pornography?
Oh, pornography, thank you.
Pornography, you see? So that's a thing that we hadn't, it was not an epidemic before like it is now, okay? So these are ways of gratifying the self while you're confined, and these are the conflicts that come out. Now, of course, the next thing is you have domestic violence, you have attacks, and the worst thing that comes out is children being abused, physically or sexually, because there's no one to whom they can tell it. There's no one that can see where they were, the welts left on them from a whipping or any of the scars, because they're not going to school, they're not going outside, and these in-house crimes are hidden. And that's one of the very fearful things that we have about the fear of conflict. Finally, the fear of the future. The fear of the future is globalization. Now, people hope it's going away. It's not going anywhere. But what it requires is the people, a lot of them, not all of them, but a large portion of those people that stormed the Congress on January 6th are people that had no jobs, because the system of what is required for employment is no longer an assembly line. They had finished high school, had a good job on an assembly line in a factory, earned enough to buy a home, a car, send the kids to school. Well, those jobs are gone because they can be done cheaper overseas. And if the highest value is in the object, what do you think corporations see in terms of do a product here or do it overseas and more cheaply, and even bring it back and sell it here more cheaply than I could make it here with the things that we have for rights for employees. So this group of men and some women are looking to the future and they're saying, I won't be able to cope with the requirements for the jobs for the future because it's all going to be technology. It's all going to be computerization. Now, when they first lost their jobs in the 70s and 80s, the government went in with programs to upgrade their skills, but they didn't accept the programs. They were only there for a week and then they quit. Why? If you look, these are all high school graduates, but if you look at their transcript, the highest math they took was general math, which is arithmetic. No algebra, no geometry, no trig, no calculus. Without those math skills, our children are falling light years behind Europeans and other countries, even some of the underdeveloped countries, we call them. Their children are having these skills. And so the biggest thing that I'm saying in terms of employment is the president is now trying to reinstate these ways of helping as our whole system moves into a new way of thinking. And we have to think in terms of the skills of yesterday will not get a man who is 50 too young to retire, but without a skill that's going to prepare him to work in this 21st century. And we also have to rethink with the epistemology. If he doesn't learn through counting and measuring, he may learn by getting the big picture and cutting to the chase, or he may learn through transcendental learning. We have to be able to offer more styles of learning for the different populations that we have. My clock is saying it's time now for questions.
Indeed. So folks, if you have questions, raise your hand. If you also can put questions in the chat. Sir, I'm wondering then, how do, it's clear that without bringing all people to the table, this is one of the things that people talk about. It's like getting a seat at the table. We don't even speak the same language, right? If we're not assimilated, we're acculturated, and it hasn't gotten us where we need to be. We're not assimilated. What needs to happen? How do these different value systems, these ways of knowing, and our ways of reasoning logically play into our ability to then communicate it and to create a world that does work for everyone?
Okay, I go back to Paige Scott, the professor at the University of Michigan.
Paige Scott.
Yes, he says that the 21st century, people will work in groups. That's the way people will work, in groups. And the heterogeneous group is the most productive, most creative group. And it says that as Americans, we have to be able to recognize that all of the talents, all the different styles of learning and what have you, make us as a group of Americans ahead of any other groups in the world. Because in their own countries, they're only acting within their one epistemology. But we have all of them right here, and we can use them all. But we have to get over the idea of us and the other. That's what we have to get past.
Yes.
We have to see ourselves as all Americans and truly believe that and act on that reality. Once we do that, whatever goes in the global economy, we can beat it, we can match it, and we can beat it. And that's the important thing. That's the dependent variable. Come together, recognizing these differences, not as a negative, but as a positive, so that you can pull all this together and we can win in this world global economy. Now, China is the number one. It's going to be the number one if we're not careful for this 21st century. And do you think that China cares, the Chinese care whether you're white or black or Hispanic or anything? They don't care at all because you're not Chinese.
Yes.
And besides that, you're not Han Chinese. So get over it. You're just some Europeans or Africans or something, but you're not Han Chinese. And we know we're the best in the whole world, says the Han Chinese. And they're proving it. If you go online and look for the trade fairs, just look for trade fairs and see what the Chinese are putting out as new things on the market. Are they copying? No, we haven't even thought of some of the things that they're doing. If you go to China now, my son left Morehouse College, which is a black men's college in Atlanta, and went to the University of Beijing, went to the language school in Beijing, found his wife, got married, and he has been in China 28 years. And when he talks to me in terms of what's going on in China and what's going on here, light years difference. If you look at the rail system in China, you can go from one place to another and the train is going more than 100 miles, almost 200 miles an hour, and it's not flying off the track. I live in Washington, D.C. From here to New York is almost 3 hours on the train, and you're going like this the whole time. If you go to France, you can go from Paris to Marseille in a couple of hours. It just goes, and you can sit down and have a beautiful white tablecloth meal, not something from the snack bar that's microwaved. We're not enjoying life.
So what do we have to give up and change then? Because clearly, I mean, everybody can relate to what you're saying. What needs to happen? What is the mentality that needs to change there because we have on the one hand the nationalism that's like America's number one, and on the other hand all this evidence that says no, we're not, and we all want to be in the same space of having what we need to have to live the good life, and looking over there and saying, how come we don't have that, or we're still better than they are? What conversations need to be had? What needs to change, sir?
Okay, we have to give up the construct of whiteness. So where does the construct start? It starts during slavery. You had white indentured servants coming from Europe, males and females, and they worked because they are lower class. See, in England, there's no white, everybody's white in England. So how do you know who's upper class and who's lower? Well, they work on that with the tonal quality. So just as soon as one opens one's mouth in the British system, it's quite clear what your class is. If you're not of the same class, if you're not going to public school, you won't have the right intonation and tonal quality. That's all there's to it. So that was the differentiation, education. So the whites that came here were from the debtor's prison and all those kinds of things. And they came here as indentured servants, and they worked right along with the black slaves, right in the same field, because in the mind of the plantation owner, they were the same. Now, people work 7 years and they're out of the indentured period. African Americans work 7 and were out up to 1665. Then the rules changed. So now what happens? You have now free indentured whites and free indentured blacks. And what do? Because they've worked and lived together, they pull together, do their farming together, and they become an economic threat to the plantation owners, which says they begin to develop an object, their economic security, which is equal to and could be greater than that of the plantation owners. So this group has to be divided in some way. And they start by cutting off the privileges of Black people. One session of the House of Burgesses after another session till finally they say that if any of your mothers were Black, you are a slave for life, which means your chattel, and all of your prodigy, all of your children, in perpetuity. Now that division had to say something then to whites that were indentured servants, saw themselves the same as the Black indentured servants. What makes them different? They said to them, you're white. So even though you might have had in the northern states a Black man who owned property could vote, free Black man in the north owning property could vote, and right next to him a white male who owned no property and could not vote, what could he say that made him feel better than the Black man? That he was white.
Indeed.
That's the myth that has been perpetuated, and that's the myth that has to be dissolved, destroyed, moved aside, or transcend beyond it. That's what the issue is.
So around that, Dr. Nichols, around what you just said, getting rid of the thought of whiteness and for us to transcend that, how in this, with this system that has been so ingrained and so, it's rooted very deeply in this country and in this system. So how do we go about changing that? How do you go about getting rid of the thought of whiteness?
Okay, it's a personal thing. So if you're a personnel officer in a company, HR, then you begin to look to see, what does your staff look like? Could you hire other people of color with comparable abilities, or do you have primarily all white? Boards, a lot of boards are all white males. Could you have women on that board? Could you have minorities on that board? You certainly have people that could make those kinds of decisions, because you have executives of very large corporations like American Express and other large companies. You have the chief executives are Black. So it isn't that there's no qualified Black people. It's just that you have to be inclusive when you are dealing with Black people. Okay, you can go to the Church of England, Anglican services, and their cities in Detroit and Newark and New York, and everybody's Black. And when you walk in there, it's just like you left England yesterday. Every aspect of the service is exactly the same. So it isn't that we are different, it's just that we've not been assimilated. And that assimilation starts with the individual and then moves to the greater society. That's the answer. You have to start as an individual and say, it is right with our condo building, with our condo. All right, you're in a condo. How many people of color are in your condo committee? Are there any people of color in your building that are different, that are Black or Hispanic or Latin? So these are the things that you have to ask yourself. And then you have to individually take the responsibility of being inclusive. Once there's inclusiveness, then people become aware that, okay, the differences aren't that great. And this is somebody that's got something to offer me. I can learn something from them, or I can share something with them, or we have something in common. But as long as we keep isolated, now the government has worked very hard to maintain this isolation. That's why you have redlining in cities, why you have ghettos and all these different things. You see, that's why you have them. It's to maintain that concept and keep it in place. So,
Thank
questions?
you. Yes. Eugene, should we go to Robert's question?
Yeah. Robert, Mr. Harris.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
I apologize for the frog in my throat. I want to appreciate the questions that you and Reverend Cobb were raising. Very, very, very important questions. I'm just going to take it on a slightly different piece, which is in terms of talking about how the scars of slavery and then prejudice and being the targets of terrorism, how that might have affected us. And I just wanted to say, I don't know if Dr. Nichols has heard of this or not, but there's in terms of the biology of things, because things do get carried through culture. This is a matter of survival. So acknowledging that. But I wonder, there's been some research that shows that when animals, not just humans, but when animals are exposed to certain kinds of trauma, of which slavery and prejudice are, that it actually doesn't change the at the biological level. We inherit genes. Doesn't change our genes, but it changes how the genes get expressed, how they become active, because we also inherit our epigenetics, which is it's a kind of machinery for genes becoming active and not. And it turns out that a researcher, a guy named Bruce McEwen, and others have discovered that when animals, because you can't really ethically do this to people, but when animals are held up or are constrained even, or when they're threatened with death, that the epigenetics change and their behavior changes, so that even if you rescue them, their behavior can change, and there's a harm that gets carried on that doesn't show up except in the situation of stress. The animals can run around, they can be happy, hey, we're good. But you throw them in a tub of water, which is where they maybe, almost drown, they'll freeze.
So, Robert, is there a question that you want to ask?
The question is, have you looked at the, my question, to make it a little more explicit. So have you had a chance to look at the biology?
Yes. This was one of the first. This was one of the first things that I started out with. That epigenetics, behavior can be affected by events in previous generations, which have been passed on through a form of genetic memory. And so all of those kinds of things are part of that. And something that you can understand even more recent as a trauma than slavery is the idea of being stopped by police. When your father gives you the talk, or when someone is listening to opera, I couldn't figure out which opera it was, but I could just hear part of it. What happens is even Black police, when they're driving and another police car comes behind them flashing the lights, they have a reaction for protectiveness because of the experiences that they've had. And they are frightened, just as frightened that they might lose their life as anyone else. So that's sort of an imprint, if you will, a modern imprint, but it's genetically transmitted.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, the opera is in German, and I
Oh, you mean that I'm listening to?
Is that what you're listening to?
I'm listening to, I happen to like Johann Sebastian Bach, and there's a piece that I'd never heard. It's called the St. Matthew's Passion. Yeah, and I'd never heard it before, so I'm listening to that in the background.
We're hearing that on here.
I was wondering, where's it coming from?
I have it right on my shelf right here, yes.
Okay, well look,
that's what we're hearing, yes. Okay, all right.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Let me mute me.
Stephanie?
I don't want anyone to go away and not ask questions. Ask questions because, I'm here to answer. And if you don't ask them, then, somebody else can't answer for me.
Dr. Nichols, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. First of all, I want to thank you for being here with us. I also taught at the University of Ibadan.
Oh.
Yes, at the Theater Arts Department.
Oh.
So the question I have for you, and I just want to share a quick anecdote. When I was living and working in Nigeria at the University of Ibadan, I had an opportunity to sit in on a history class. And the Nigerian professor had said that it was okay that we were in cahoots, the royalty of Nigeria were in cahoots with the white slave traders, because the Blacks that were sent or were enslaved were imbeciles, were the less than us. And I mean us as Nigerian ruling class. So my question for you is, how does the paradigm work when there's a level of assimilation that exists among upper class Blacks, particularly in Africa? Like how, the intersection of race and class, and how does that manifest, or, how do you analyze it when in regards to the anecdote I just shared with you?
Okay, when Oba so-and-so and so-and-so Obulawala comes to New York and gets off the plane, he's Black and he will be treated as a Black. So that's the reality that many of them have had, that they go to England to study, and they can't get a room to stay in because no white people don't want them in their places. That was the early experiences that they've had. And when you look at the migration of Africans to Europe, but even to France, they experience discrimination because they're not white. The conflict comes when you have someone who grows up in Martinique or Guadeloupe, and as long as they're on the islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe, they are thoroughly French. Every cuisine, everything you can imagine, they're French. They all pass the baccalaureate, and they go then to France to study. And that's when they recognize, and what I've tried to help them to realize is that they have French citizenship in the minds of the other French, but they don't have French nationality, which means, are you from Normandy? Are you from Rouen? Or what province do you come from that gives you that identity as French? So you see, these are the cognitive dissonance that people have. Now, the man that made that statement in your history class was, Christian Charity prevents me from really telling you just what I think about him, but he was sadly mistaken. Sadly mistaken. Sadly mistaken.
Yeah.
Because Yorubas of all classes were brought into slavery.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to read this question from Sheila Smith. It's 124. And depending on how long the answer is and all of that, Sheila, Sarah, we may need to, now people are wanting to ask questions at the end of time. I love it. So we'll see how we go with time, okay? So this question that I'm reading from the chat is from Sheila Smith. Dr. Henry Clark asserted, when Black people educated their own people via segregation, we were stronger, and that desegregation was harmful to us because people who hated us educated us. I am curious to know your thoughts, Dr. Nichols, in terms of assimilation.
Okay, I have a colleague, Dr. Joy DeGruy.
Oh, yeah.
Who gives you the post-traumatic slavery syndrome.
Yes.
I'm a mentor to her, okay? She's very concerned about the characteristics and personalities of many white teachers that teach in the elementary schools. And she's trying to develop an instrument which could make an assessment and evaluation as to the appropriateness of some of these people, because they have so many unconscious cultural biases and so many forms of microaggressions that really cripple children. Now, that's a part of it. Another part is that our children are placed into a situation where you have to learn one epistemological model and you come to school with another, and they expect you to be able to jump very quickly from one to the other. Little girls do it very quickly. Little boys, 8 years of age, 3rd grade, many of them still have not been able to make that jump. So let me give you some quick examples. If I'm the teacher teaching, I'm a white woman teaching elementary school, 3rd grade, 8-year-old Black students and white students in class. The object is, our unit for this week, children, is the unit so-and-so. That's the object. I'm going to give you a series of exercises. Those are the parts, okay, that become the whole. I'm going to give you in each exercise there, and each part that I give you, there are exercises for you to do, which is to count and measure within each of those. So good morning, boys and girls. Today is Monday. I'm going to give you part A, and in part A are exercises that you can count and measure. Tuesday, part B, Wednesday, part C. All right, Leroy raises his hand and says, I don't understand. And the teacher says very politely, just continue to do the exercises, you'll be fine. The test is given on Friday. 80% pass, Leroy, and 20% don't pass. 2/3 of the way into the semester, the light bulb goes off in Leroy's head. He starts to do his homework and he gets everything correct. And the teacher, of course, is wondering how on earth, when he's failed 2/3 of the semester, is he now getting everything correct? And what is the assumption that is made? He must be doing what? Yes. So she asks him, from whom did you copy the material? I ain't copied from anyone. Tell us then how you got the answer. He says, well, I just did it. Then she becomes angry and annoyed because he's being evasive. He's not giving her a dichotomous answer, yes or no. I copied, no, I didn't copy. He's just kind of like, I didn't copy, but I don't know how I got the answer. I want to stop right here because this is very important. At the end of the teacher's manual for arithmetic, to solve this problem, there are 7 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Because of the epistemology of Leroy, a holistic thinker who uses critical path analysis, once he grasped the idea that every day she was not giving him a whole, she was giving him only a part. He recognized that he was only getting parts, not each one of those every day was a whole. Then he solves the problem with critical path analysis, cut to the chase. So to solve the problem in critical path analysis, he used step 1, step 4, and step 7. And she's looking, saying, where are steps 2, 3, 5, and 6? He says, I don't know, I don't need them. She says, you can't pass if you don't give me all the steps because I don't know how you got the answer. Well, that's a stumbling block because he doesn't know how to go back and unprogram critical path analysis. He doesn't even know critical path analysis. He just knows that he could do it with what she sees as step 1, step 4, step 1, step 4, and step 7. He could do it. And she's looking for 2, 3, 5, and 6. Now, what happens is when you look at the data, this is the point at which a major portion of Black children that are going to go into special ed, they shift out of her class into special ed. And that's the pipeline from school to the prison. And that's because no one understands the epistemology of our children that are coming to school. So if you were a Black teacher in the South and you taught for years, of course you would understand that the children have different ways of knowing. And as a Black teacher, you would be more successful. So it isn't so much white and Black as it is, does the teacher know? Now, there are some situations in which you have racist teachers. So you have to get them out of the way. But if this is a well-meaning teacher, she's culturally tuned in and she knows the different epistemological models, she can teach. But if she has all these little reserved things in her mind about the limitations of Blacks and so forth and so on. If you take Joy DeGruy, in her high school counseling, they said that she was not qualified to go to college. She would never make it through college. She has 4 degrees, okay? So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Ooh, ladies and ladies, the ones who have your hands up, I am so sorry we are out of time. Dr. Edwin J. Nichols, thank you so very much for being with us. What a beautiful program we have had today. I'm gonna just wish everybody a great week as I now turn it back over to my beautiful co-host, the Reverend Lane Cobb.
Just before you come in, Dr. Reverend Cobb, I would like to say that if these questions can be written down and you email them to me, I'll try to answer them.
Well, now, everybody has my email address, so send your questions to me. I will get them to Dr. Nichols. And Dr. Nichols, we have got to have you back. It breaks my heart that we have to end the show right now. And I know I speak for more than a few people here. So I will be calling you almost immediately after this broadcast to find out when we can have you back again. Sir, thank you for your generosity and your expertise in all of the work that you do. Please join us next week, folks. We will have Dr. Judy Morley to speak about emotional intelligence and anti-racism. And this is going to be a very, very good show as well. We look forward to seeing you, everyone. Have a fabulous afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone.